Welcome back. So this video is all about watercolor tips and getting started and comfortable with watercolors in particular. So here I've written down some basic tips and I'm just going to go ahead and walk you through and show you a couple practices just so you can get acquainted with your watercolors. First thing, with watercolors, you need to work light to dark. And that kind of goes with our second tip, which is also to layer, layer, layer. So you're going to layer from light to dark, building up to get those really, really dark or bold or saturated colors. Okay, so you end up layering over and over again. When you see those like brighter colors or those darker colors, that's how they're getting there. You don't want to try and make this really bright saturated color at first and put it on there because chances are you're going to have too much pigment, not enough water, and it's not going to look right. And so instead what we do is we just layer and layer and layer. Number three, so with watercolor, in order to get white areas, you actually just leave it blank. So you're going to leave gaps and you're going to be very purposeful. If you know that a certain element in your image is going to be white or very light even, then purposely paint around those areas. Professional artists also use different tips and tricks to actually like put down things like masking fluid and things to protect those areas. But for us, we're just going to go around them and we're going to be intentional about that so that we leave those white so that they stay nice and crisp, and we'll paint all the other things. Number four, so when you're mixing, and you'll see this here in a little bit, you're actually going to mix in the lid or in the palette. So all of our watercolor trays have these lids, which looks like just a normal lid, but in fact, this is where you mix. That's why it has these little separations, so it's not just one big mixing area. And you can mix in here and apply water so that you're not pulling directly from your watercolors. You're pulling from your palette so that you have a little more control with the colors that you're creating. And yeah, so that's where you're gonna mix. Number five, as you're working, you're probably gonna start off with a very light pencil sketch just so that you know where things are. That also helps you plan ahead to make sure you leave like the white areas white. But as you're doing that, you wanna make sure you're erasing those pencil lines. You don't want to still have those pencil lines in the ends, and especially if you have some lighter areas. Those lighter areas are not going to cover up the pencil line, so you really need to be intentional in erasing those so it looks nice and finished and we can't see those little pre-sketches. Number six, with all painting, we want to avoid straight black. Now, there's some situations where you really can't get it as dark as you want it to be without using black, but usually we alter the black in some way by either making it actually like a really, really dark navy by adding a little blue, a really dark purple, a really dark green, a really dark brown, whatever it is. But we usually try and keep from doing straight black unless you're doing like a black and white painting, because black can actually flatten things and you lose a lot of the dimension. And so just a good rule of thumb is just to avoid that. Number seven, make sure you're using the right brush, an appropriate brush. And I know that I was only able to give one brush, which honestly probably is not the best one, but unfortunately, that's just what was available to be able to take home. So if you have any other brushes lying around, I know some people do, many don't, but if you do, grab those and use them. Having a nice variety of brushes, small and large, is going to make this a lot easier. I usually work with a detail brush and then like a medium one and a larger one. But you can use what I gave you. You just have to be purposeful about it and use the different parts of it. So if I'm trying to get little details, then I'm only gonna put paint right on the very ends. If I'm trying to get larger areas, then I'm going to go ahead and load up the entire brush and use that whole brush. Okay, so those are my basic tips. Couple things just to get acquainted with your watercolors as you're working. And you can follow along with me in your sketchbook. First thing you need to do, in fact, I'm going to pull this down here. You need to make sure that you have all the supplies you need. So you should have some cup of water. You can use whatever you have. Have a paper towel or like a rag or something that you can dry off your brush. It's really important to be able to control how wet or dry your brush is. And then your watercolors that were provided. Clean lid, so if your lid is messy from a different time, then make sure you wipe that down. And then whatever you're going to paint on. Right now, I'm just going to show you in our sketchbook. On the final project, you're always going to do it on actual watercolor paper. You'll notice it works way better and absorbs that paint. But for the purpose of just practice, you can use whatever you have. So to be able to activate the different colors, you first need to just put paint in the different pigments, or put some water in each of those pigments just to get them started. And then if you're going to mix, another option is to start with some water over here and then activate by applying water there. Put it in your palette, and I know if you have the clear palette, then sometimes it's nice to work on top of white paper. Clean off your brush, so you're cleaning your brush quite regularly so that you don't end up applying like purple into another color. And then grab your next color and put them together, and then just make sure you're cleaning as you're applying different colors until you get a color that you like. So maybe I like this one. If I wanted it to be a deeper color, that's when I could apply some black. So I could come over here and grab black. Make it maybe a darker, like indigo color. If I want it to be more of a neutral color, I'm actually going to apply the opposite, so the complementary color of whatever these are. So if I'm working with kind of a purpley color, then on our color wheel, the opposite would be yellow. So really important to have a clean brush when you go into yellow. You'll notice yellow gets pretty gross pretty fast. I'm going to grab some yellow and pull that in. And that's going to kind of dilute the color and make it more of a neutral. You can kind of play with mixing different colors. Once you have a color that you like, also play with getting some different values of that color. So I can start with this one up here. There's kind of a gray blue happening right now. Make sure you're loading up your brush. If your brush starts to do, let's see, this, where you can see like almost like fuzzy edges, that means you just don't have enough paint on your brush. So you need to grab some more water, grab some more of your pigment. So I've created a little rectangle to start. And then I'm going to apply some more water, and that should get me a little bit lighter version. Apply some more water and a little bit lighter version so you can practice creating a value scale and getting all different values. So you notice the more water you use and the less pigment you use, the lighter it's going to be. So a lot of times when people are starting with watercolors, they ask me, well, how do I get the light areas? How do I get white? I don't even know how to mix that. It's because you don't mix it. It's because you're just applying more water and less pigment. And that doesn't mean that your brush is necessarily like drenching with water. It just means over here when you're mixing it, you have more water to pigment in your ratio. Okay, and then you just still grab however much paint you need and then use it. Okay, so it takes a little bit of practice. There's also a couple different techniques with watercolors that can be really helpful. The first one is if you want it to, if you want the watercolors to be like more blurry, then you can start with water on your paper. And I know the sketchbook paper is not great for this, but it should still work. And then I'll grab some red for this. As you put your paint on there, it's going to blur. And so if you want maybe like a couple different colors to blur together, maybe this is more of like a background, then that's how you're gonna do it. You're gonna start with water first, and you're gonna work what's called wet on wet. Whereas if you want it to be, if you're trying to add details and you're trying to make crisp edges, then you need to make sure that it dries. And watercolor dries fairly quickly, usually within about 10 minutes. You can speed up the process with a hair dryer if you have one, or you can just wait and come back to that area. But if you let it dry completely, which I don't think I have any areas that are dry, but the paper is dry, then you can get a nice crisp edge. So we call that wet on dry. And so depending on what you're trying to do with your different layers, you either may need to wait to let something dry or apply it quickly before it dries. It's up to you. All right, those are the basics of watercolor. So next you're gonna get into how to create your color wheel, and then we'll get started on your project soon.